You're trespassing on Prescott land, mister, and you've got about 10 seconds to explain. Why before I ride back and fetch my father's men? Silas Cooper looked up from the fence post. He'd been driving into the cracked earth and squinted at the woman on the black mare, backlit by a sun so fierce it turned her into a shadow with a rifle voice. He wiped his forearm across his brow, leaving a streak of dust through the sweat, and answered slow, the way a man does when he's already tired of explaining himself. Wasn't Prescott land last week? Banks sold it to me fair and square. Got the paper folded up in my coat if you'd care to look. She didn't move to look. She sat that horse like she'd been born in the saddle, chin tipped up. And something in her eyes told him she already knew the paper was real and hated that it was. Her name was Josephine Prescott, though he wouldn't learn that for another few minutes. And she was the only daughter of Wendell Prescott, who owned near every blade of grass a man could see from a church steeple in 3 counties. The ranch Silas had just bought, the old Whitlock place, 40 acres of dry, forgotten dirt with a house half swallowed by weeds and a barn leaning like a drunk uncle at a wedding, sat wedged right up against Prescott, land like a burr under a saddle. Nobody in town had wanted it. Nobody but Silas, who had exactly $211 to his name and a debt of pride so heavy it had walked him 1,200 miles from a Georgia farm his family lost to bad seed and worse luck. The Whitlock place. Josephine said, like the words tasted bitter. My father tried to buy that land for years. Old man Whitlock wouldn't sell it to him out of spite. And now he's dead, and it's gone to some drifter with a hammer and a hat too big for his head. Hat fits fine, Silas said, and went back to his post. She sat there a moment longer, clearly unused to being dismissed. And then she wheeled that mare around so hard the dust kicked up like a small storm, and she was gone, leaving Silas alone with his 40 acres of nothing and the ghost of a laugh caught somewhere behind his ribs. He hadn't laughed in a long while. There hadn't been much cause, too. He'd grown up the youngest of 4 boys on land that never gave more than it took. Watched his father's hands turn to leather, trying to wring cotton out of soil gone thin. Watched 2 brothers die of fever in the same terrible summer, and the third run off to Texas and never write again. When the bank finally took the farm, his mother had looked at him, the last one left, 17 years old and already carrying a grown man's grief, and said the kindest, cruelest thing anyone ever told him. You were always the one who could start over. She died the following spring, and Silas had been starting over ever since, town by town, job by job, saving every coin like it was the last one he'd ever hold, until he had enough to buy a ruin nobody else wanted and call it his. He didn't tell anyone that. Not the man at the bank, not the shopkeep who sold him nails on credit, and certainly not the golden-haired woman who rode onto his land like she owned the wind itself. But Josephine Prescott had wounds of her own, buried under silk and good breeding the way his were buried under sun and callous. Her mother had passed when she was 12, and her father, in his grief, had turned the entire Prescott empire into a monument he expected her to inherit, and never once asked if she wanted. Every suitor who came sniffing around the Prescott ranch came for the land, not the woman standing on it. And she'd learned young to test every man the way you'd test ice on a pond, cautious, cold, ready to pull back the second it looked like it might crack under her. She rode back 3 days later. Silas was up on the barn roof, replacing shingles that had rotted clean through, when he heard the mare's hooves again and looked down to find her sitting there studying him like he was a puzzle she resented not being able to solve. You're still here, she said. Where else would I be? Bought the place. Most men who buy the Whitlock place don't stay past the first frost. There's no water on this side of the ridge worth mentioning. Whitlock's well went dry 6 years back, and he never found another vein. Silas came down off that roof slow, favoring the leg he'd broken as a boy and never had properly set. and stood in the yard wiping his hands on a rag gone gray with grime. "Then I reckon I'll dig till I find one." "You'll dig for years." "Then I'll dig for years." Something flickered across her face, then not quite respect, not quite pity. Some third thing she didn't have a name for, and she turned that mare and rode off again without another word. But she came back the following week and the week after that, always with some excuse about checking a boundary line or asking after a stray calf. And Silas, no fool, understood well enough that a woman with 300 head of cattle and a foreman for every task under heaven did not need to personally inspect fence lines on a stranger's ruined property. He never said so. He just kept fixing what he could fix and let her watch him do it. And somewhere in the fixing, the silences between them stopped feeling like standoffs and started feeling like something closer to company. It was on an evening in late September, with the sky gone the color of a healing bruise, that her father found out. Wendell Prescott rode up to the Whitlock place. No, the Cooper place now. Though nobody in town had started calling it that yet, with 4 of his men trailing him and a look on his face, like a man inspecting a debt he intended to collect. Silas was at the well he'd been digging by hand for 2 months, down 11 feet and still dry, when the shadow of 5 horses fell across him. "You've been putting notions in my daughter's head," Wendell said, not bothering with a greeting. "Don't know what notions you mean." "Sir," Silas climbed out of the hole, dirt to his elbows, and stood his ground, even though every instinct told him 5 mounted men and 1 man on foot was not a fair fight in any sense. "She rides out here near every week. Comes back with dirt on her boots and a look on her face I haven't seen since her mother was alive. I know what that look means, Mr. Cooper, and I'll tell you plainly, it will not happen. You've got no money, no name, and no land worth the name land. You've got a hole in the ground and a house the termites are still deciding whether to finish off." "I've got a deed," Silas said quietly. "Same as you. A deed to dirt." Wendell's horse stamped, impatient, sensing its rider's temper. "My daughter is worth more than dirt, Mr. Cooper. She's worth the whole territory. And I built that worth with 40 years of my own back and blood. And I will not see it handed to a man who'll lose it inside a season." He turned his horse then, and the 4 men followed. And Silas stood there in the long blue evening with dirt on his hands and something colder settling in his chest. The old familiar shame he thought he'd buried in Georgia, clawing back up through the ribs. "You've got no money, no name." He'd heard some version of that sentence his whole life from the banker, from the men who wouldn't hire a Cooper because Coopers had a habit of failing at everything they touched, and hearing it again, aimed now not just at him, but at the fragile good thing growing between him and a woman he hadn't even kissed yet. Near broke something in him that had held for 26 years. Josephine came that night anyway, riding hard in the dark with no lantern, which told him plainly enough that she'd overheard the whole thing or been told after. And when she slid off that mare, her eyes were wet and furious in equal measure. "He had no right," she said. "He's your father. Reckon he's got every right where you're concerned. Don't you dare take his side." "Ain't taking sides, Josephine. Just saying a man who loves his daughter's going to fight for what he thinks keeps her safe. Can't blame him for loving you fierce, even if he's wrong about the way of it." She was quiet a long moment, standing in the dark yard with the crickets going and the well behind them still dry and useless. 11 feet of nothing. "Are you saying he's wrong? About the deed to dirt part?" "No, he's dead right. I've got nothing, Josephine. Nothing but stubbornness and a busted leg that aches when it rains." He looked at her plain, no hiding in it. "But about you being worth more than what I could ever give you, on that count, he's not wrong either. And that's the trouble, isn't it? I know exactly what I am. A poor man digging a dry well on land nobody wanted. hoping to God something changes before winter takes what little I've got left. You deserve a man who can offer you something besides hope." "I never asked for anything besides hope," she said, and her voice cracked clean down the middle. "Everyone in my life has wanted something from me my whole life, Silas. My father wants an heir to his empire. Every man who ever called on me wanted the Prescott name stamped on his own. You're the only person who's ever just wanted me to keep digging. You never once asked me for a single thing." "Didn't have anything to ask you for," he said. And something in the way he said it, low and honest and a little broken, made her cross the yard and put both hands flat on his chest, like she was checking whether the thing underneath was as solid as it looked. "Ask me for something now," she said. He didn't kiss her that night. He wanted to, Lord, he wanted to. But a man raised right doesn't take a woman's heart in the same breath her fathers just called him worthless. Not without something to stand on besides want. Instead, he held her hands there against his chest a moment and said, "Ask me again once I've got water in that well. Ask me again once I've got something worth calling a life. I won't have you giving up an empire for a man with a hole in the ground." She laughed, wet and surprised, right there in the dark. "You are the most stubborn man I have ever met. Runs in the family," he said. "It's about the only thing that does." Winter came hard that year, the way it does on the high plains. And Silas dug through the frost line with a pick and a lantern most nights because daylight wasn't long enough anymore. He was down to 16 feet with no water and his hands split open in 3 places and his savings gone entirely to seed and lumber and the vet bill for the one milk cow he owned. When Wendell Prescott's cattle started dying, it wasn't Silas's doing. And everyone in 3 counties would eventually come to know that. But for 2 terrible weeks, the story going around town was that somebody had poisoned the Prescott water tank on the North Range, and half of them pointed a finger straight at the poor drifter, squatting on the Whitlock ruin, who had every reason in the world to hold a grudge against Wendell Prescott. A deputy came out and asked him where he'd been the nights in question. And Silas, having no alibi beyond a dry well and his own 2 hands, told the truth. He'd been digging, alone, same as every night, which was no alibi at all in the eyes of men looking for someone to blame. Word got to town fast and ugly. By the time Silas rode in for supplies, the shopkeep wouldn't sell to him. And 2 men outside the saloon called him poisoner loud enough for the whole street to hear. And Silas stood there in the cold with his hat in his hand and felt the old shame rise up whole and complete. The Cooper name dragged through mud again, just like it always had been. Just like his mother always feared it would be. And he understood in that moment that a man with nothing has no defense against an accusation. Because nothing is exactly what people expect of him. He rode back to the Whitlock place that night, meaning to leave. He'd already decided it, sitting there in the saddle with the wind cutting through his coat. Pack up what little he had. Ride on before he dragged Josephine's name down into his own ruin. Before Wendell Prescott had one more reason to call him exactly the kind of nothing he'd always been called. It was the coward's math, and he knew it even as he did the figuring. But shame has its own arithmetic, and it rarely adds up to courage. Josephine found him loading his 1 horse in the dark. "You're running," she said. "Not a question." "I'm sparing you," he said. "Whole town thinks I poisoned your father's cattle." "I didn't do it, Josephine. I swear it on my mother's grave." "But it doesn't matter what I swear when I've got nothing to my name to make anybody believe me. You stay tied to a man like that, it ruins you too. I've seen what a ruined name does to a family. Seen it eat my own family alive. I won't do that to you. So instead, you'll ruin yourself," she said, "by running before anyone even asked you to stand trial for anything. That's not sparing me, Silas Cooper. That's you deciding I'm not strong enough to stand beside a man the town's got wrong about. That's you doing exactly what my father did, deciding what's good for me without asking me a single thing about what I want. That landed. He stood there with the horse's lead rope slack in his hand and felt it land clean and true, and she kept going, quieter now. I know you didn't touch that water tank. I know because I know you. And I have spent every week since September watching you dig a hole with your bare hands rather than ask a single soul for help. Rather than take one shortcut, rather than lie about a single thing, including how poor you are and how scared you are of turning out the way your family turned out. A man that's stubborn about the truth doesn't poison cattle in the dark and lie about it after. My father's foreman found the tank cracked clean through this afternoon. Old rust, nothing more. Some seam gave way in the cold. It's already spreading through town. You'd have known if you hadn't already decided to run before anybody could tell you the truth. Silas stood very still. The tank cracked. The tank cracked, she said. Nobody poisoned anything. You've spent all night packing a horse over a lie that was already unraveling on its own. Because some part of you needed it to be true, so you'd have an excuse to leave before I could. He didn't have an answer for that, because there wasn't one that didn't shame him further. And so he did the only honest thing left to do, which was drop the lead rope and cross the yard, and finally, after months of digging and waiting and holding himself back on principle, kiss her the way he'd wanted to since that first day she rode up calling him a trespasser. She kissed him back like she'd been waiting on it just as long. Both of them cold-handed and wind-chapped and not caring one bit. Spring found the well finally struck water, 19 feet down, cold and clear and sweeter than anything Silas had tasted in his whole hard life, and it found Wendell Prescott standing in the mud of the Whitlock yard with his hat in his hands for once instead of his temper. Having ridden out personally to apologize for the accusation that had never been his doing but had spread on his land and under his name all the same. I was wrong about the water tank, he said, stiff as a fence post. And I expect I was wrong about a few other things besides. Your foreman find the crack himself. Silas asked, not unkind, just plain. He did. I should have trusted my own daughter's read on a man before I trusted the loose talk of a saloon full of fools. She tells me you never once asked her for a thing. He looked around the yard, the mended barn, the new well housing. The fence line straight and true where nothing had stood a year before, and something in his hard face loosened. Whitlock let this land go to ruin because he was too proud to ask anybody for help digging that well. You dug it anyway, alone, in the dead of winter, and never once came knocking on my door for so much as a shovel. Wouldn't have opened for me if I had. No, Wendell admitted, I wouldn't have. That's my failing, not yours. He held out his hand then, and Silas, after a long moment, took it. My daughter's stubborn as a Missouri mule, and she loves you plain as day. And I've learned the hard way that fighting Prescott's stubbornness only makes it worse. So I'll say what I ought to have said back in September. Welcome to the family, Mr. Cooper, water and all. They were married that June under a cottonwood tree on the boundary line between the two ranches. The fence between them long since taken down. And Josephine wore her mother's pearl combs and cried through the whole thing without a single bit of shame about it. And Silas stood there in a borrowed suit with dirt he couldn't quite scrub from under his nails, thinking of a mother who told a 17-year-old boy he was the one who could start over, wishing to God she could see now exactly what he'd started. Years later, when their own children were old enough to ask about the beginning of it, Josephine would tell it a certain way, the trespasser story. The dry well, the terrible winter, and always ended the same way. With Silas standing in the yard holding a lead rope he never used, having finally learned the only thing his whole hard life hadn't yet taught him, that the truest kind of wealth was never a thing a man could dig up out of the ground, but a woman willing to stand beside him in the mud and wait for the water to come.